I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present.
So during this talk, I would like to tell you about a theory of information processing in the brain called predictive coding, by which I've been fascinated by over the last several years. And I would like to tell you about our attempts to use these models to describe learning in humans and animals. And this work was done by talented people, in particular postdoctoral researchers Yuhang Song and Beren Milic from my group, as well as Tommaso Salvatori, who is a PhD student in a group of my collaborator, Tomasz Lukasiewicz. So what is predictive coding? So predictive coding is a theory which assumes that the brain is constantly trying to predict the sensory inputs we receive. And in order to make these accurate predictions, it needs to learn a generative model of the world. So these first two points are kind of very general and probably are assumption made by many models in the kind of Bayesian brain umbrella. However, what is special about predictive coding, that it also describes how this prediction and learning could be performed in a neural circuits. So it describes a particular mapping of this Bayesian inference on the neural circuits, which relies only on local computation and local plasticity, and provides this kind of like biologically plausible way of performing this computation. So the word, we had this discussion with Marta in the morning, that the word predictive coding is used in two different contexts. So sometimes it's used to describe the general theory of brain generating predictions, but it's also sometimes used to describe a particular model, so a particular mathematical formulation of predictive coding. And this mathematical formulation has been originally developed by Ryan Ballard, who developed in the context of unsupervised learning in visual cortex. And then, of course, the predictive coding framework is probably most closely associated with Carl Friston, who developed this in many very interesting direction and linked it with both biological data and with statistical inference. So we got also interested in this framework, and the first contribution we made is we noticed that if these predictive coding networks are used not for unsupervised learning, as originally done by Ryan Ballard, but actually are used for supervised learning, then they approximate the backpropagation algorithm from connectionist models. And as you know, the backpropagation algorithm has been kind of developed in the 80s and has been used to describe many different tasks in psychology, but it has been always criticized as being kind of biologically implausible because the errors were not computed by the network, were computed by some kind of agent. So, it was always questionable how you could do something like backpropagation in the brain. So we got very excited because we thought that, well, this predictive coding provides a way in which the brain could approximate backpropagation in a biologically plausible way, only using local computation and local synaptic plasticity. But we also noticed that these predictive coding networks would mathematically, you can show that they converge to backpropagation for particular parameters, which are very strange parameters and very unusual parameters for this model, which are kind of unlikely to be realized actually in the brain. So over the last few years, we tried to kind of understand what predictive coding is doing in this kind of more natural parameters where it doesn't converge to backpropagation. And then we noticed that it's actually doing something different than backprop. And we call this learning principle prospective configuration. And we actually think it's actually much more clever than backprop. So I will try to, during this talk, explain what we think, what is the principle of prospective configuration, which we think is the kind of fundamental principle of learning in these hierarchical networks in the brain. And then I will describe predictive coding in an intuitive way, provide you some kind of intuition for how these predictive coding networks work. And then I will try to argue that they provide advantages for in learning for animals in a biological context. So in this predictive coding networks actually can learn more effectively than standard connectionist networks with backpropagation in the type of tasks which animals and humans often face in nature. And then show you 3 examples of various tasks where we try to explain with predictive coding various patterns of neural activity and behavior, which cannot be explained by backpropagation in simple connectionist models. And of course, if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to interrupt at any time. So what's the difference between prospective configuration and backpropagation? So can I ask who is familiar with backpropagation? Yes, so most people know how it works. Yes, so as you know, backpropagation works in the following way, that it modifies the weights in the neural network to reduce some kind of error at the output of this network. So what you are trying to do in backpropagation, you are trying to directly minimize the weights or optimize the weights to minimize the error. So what predictive coding networks do, they do something different. Before they minimize the weights, optimize the weights, they first modify neural activity in all the layers of the network to a pattern that the network should produce after learning. And this pattern, this desired pattern, should be the pattern such that the target, the activity at the output is equal to the target, while in the hidden layers, each neuron will have activity quite similar to its input, because you don't want to kind of change the activity too much through the plasticity. So you want to kind of reorganize, reconfigure all the neurons in the network such that the output is correct and all the neurons are just shifted just by a little bit. And then once you find this pattern, you modify the weights to reinforce this pattern. And we call this kind of desired pattern prospective configuration, because this is the configuration which should take place after learning in this network. And we notice that because of this intermediate step of finding this prospective configuration, predictive coding networks actually reduce interference in comparison to backpropagation. So you might have heard that in kind of standard connectionist models with backpropagation, there's this problem of interference, that information which is being learned interferes with other pieces of information that have been learned previously. And we notice that with predictive coding, thanks to this reorganization of activity, the interference is reduced. So let me now start with I'll give you a very simple example. So we try to come up with a minimum example that demonstrates why this prospective configuration reduces interference. So this is the kind of the simplest example we could come up with. So very often, the brain needs to make prediction about some modalities on the basis of information from other modalities. So imagine that there is a bear which usually hunts for salmon by this river. So when the bear sees the river, the brain will generate the prediction of smelling the salmon and hearing the noise of the river. But imagine that on a given day, the bear doesn't hear the river because it has injured ear, possibly in a fight with another bigger bear. So there is a prediction error in the auditory cortex because the sound is predicted but not heard. And the bear needs to learn that there is no sound, so it needs to kind of reduce this prediction error during learning. And of course, backpropagation can also do this for you, right? So what the backpropagation would do, it would just propagate this error through the network. And the kind of the key point here is also that while the backpropagation propagates the errors, the activity of neurons doesn't change. So the activity of neurons will be denoted by color. And while you propagate errors in the backpropagation, you don't change the activity. And then you change the weights. And what the backpropagation would do would just reduce the weights on the entire pathway from the visual cortex to the auditory cortex. And this solves our problem because, you know, on the next trial, the prediction for the sound will be reduced so that the bear has learned. However, please note the problem that because the backpropagation reduces these weights, it would also reduce the prediction for the smell, even though the smell was correctly predicted on the previous trial. And this is an example of interference, which is quite striking, because normally in connectionist literature, people talk about interference between current stimulus and the previous stimulus. And this example demonstrates that even with back-propagation, learning part of information in the same pattern may interfere with information in the other pattern, right? So you can see that, because these weights were decreased on the next trial, the prediction will be smaller for the smell, and our bear may not even hunt for salmon because it will think that there is no salmon in the river and be hungry, which is really bad. But luckily, predictive coding can solve this problem. So what the predictive coding will do is that first, it will optimize the pattern of activity the network should produce. So we want to predict the smell, but not predict the sound. And in order to do this, you probably want to decrease the activity of these neurons, these hidden neurons, right? And what predictive coding networks also do is that they constantly recalculate the errors. So once you decrease activity of this neuron, the network realizes that there would be an error on this output neuron, because now the neuron should be active, but doesn't get enough input. So there is like a positive prediction error. So the activity is bigger than the input. And what the predictive coding networks would do, they would immediately increase this weight during learning, which is not performed by backpropagation. And because they increase this weight to basically reduce this error here, on the next trial, the interference is reduced, and our bear predicts the smell of salmon. Okay, so now you might ask yourself, how do these magical predictive coding networks work? And many of you might have seen the kind of various papers describing them and the equations. And essentially, these predictive coding networks are sometimes difficult to study or difficult to understand because they are described by this complicated set of differential equations. But Yuhang Song, my former student, he came up with this amazing mechanical analogy, which is basically an abstract machine made of rods and springs, which is mathematically equivalent to predictive coding. So instead of showing you the equations, I will just describe the machine, which I think gives a very nice intuitive understanding how these networks work. So I will introduce this machine on a very simple example of a network with 3 neurons, which are just connected through 2 weights. So in this machine, the activity of a neuron corresponds to a height of a node which can slide on a vertical pole. The connection between the neurons corresponds to a rod pointing to another node. And essentially, the height of this input node is determined by the input neuron and the weight. So basically, it's a scaled version of the activity of the neuron. So basically, the weight controls how the activity of this neuron translates to this input node. Now, so we have this example. So we have 3 neurons, and this is little active, this is medium activity, and this is the most active neuron. And in this example, the weights would have weight 1. So the activity is basically transmitted with the same value. And in predictive coding networks, the activity of neuron is not fixed to its input as in a traditional artificial neural network, but it's basically linked with it. And you can imagine that there is a spring connecting the activity of a neuron and an input. And the spring is such that in its low energy state, in its default state, it's totally reduced in its length. So basically, the spring tries to bring the activity of the neuron to the input. Okay, so this is how this machine works. So now, when the network makes a prediction, we provide an input, which we can imagine would correspond to fixing this node. So there's this little pin drawn here. And during the relaxation of this network, the neurons can change their activity And the relaxation is aiming at reducing the energy of the springs, the potential energy of the springs. So basically, in this example, all the springs will collapse and the network will produce this output. And this is, you can see that this is exactly the same output which artificial neural network would produce in this case. Now, what happens during training of these networks is that now we fix both, if we, for example, do supervised learning, we fix both input and output. So we have pins in both positions. And now after relaxation, the errors can no longer be reduced to 0. So the network will converge to this configuration here, where there would be some kind of intermediate activity of this neuron, which basically will minimize the total energy in the network. And then once the energy cannot be reduced by changing the neurons anymore, we change the weight to reduce the energy. So in this case, basically, again, we would increase this weight and increase this weight to kind of tune the network. Okay, and so you have made a little animation showing how this network works on the simple example. So basically, we have 3 neurons here. The blue circles are the neurons. The white ones are the inputs. The strings are not drawn, but you can imagine that there are strings here, and then you have numerical values for weights and activities shown here. Okay, and now how do I animate this? No, it was working before.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just go out from the presentation.
I think if you move to the other screen. Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the network is making prediction now. So the only input is fixed. Now we provide a target. So it goes to an equilibrium. And now we modify the weights and make prediction again. And you can see that the next time the network makes the prediction, which is kind of closer to the target than the first time. Okay, fantastic. Okay, and I will not describe this detail, but you can actually look this up, that the original predictive coding networks are described by an architecture which involves a population of neurons which encode the variables and neurons which encode prediction errors, which basically activity of this prediction errors neurons corresponds to the extension of the spring. And this network is cleverly has a very simple connectivity and very simple dynamics, but it's set up such that essentially it has exactly the same dynamics as this machine. So you can essentially set up a network of neurons which will behave exactly like this machine. And the the weights connect. What's really beautiful here is that the weights connect the activities of neurons and the springs and the errors. So all the error-driven learning corresponds to just the Hebbian plasticity proportional to the activity of input and activity of the error node. Right? So basically all this kind of weight changes which minimize the errors could be also realized just by Hebbian plasticity. Okay, so just wanted to kind of illustrate that this network is able to solve the salmon problem. So this is another visualization here. So this is the visual cortex, this is the olfactory cortex and the auditory cortex. So the bear sees the river, smells the salmon, but doesn't hear the river. So there is a big prediction error here. And now if the network relaxes, this prediction error is reduced, but we move this hidden node. So we introduce immediately a prediction error on the smell. So then during a weight update, we move the weights to reduce the error. So this weight goes down, but this weight goes up because there is a tension in this direction. So on the next trial, although this weight went down, this weight went up, so the network is able to correctly predict smell, which would not be the case with artificial neural network and back-prop. Okay, any questions? Yes. Yeah, please.
going to ask if you can minimize the picture because we can't see.
Oh.
No, yeah, so basically using the way the point is the function onto
Okay. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. So basically, what happens on the next trial when the network is making prediction? So although this weight went down, this weight went up. So the network is still able to correctly predict the smell of salmon, which wouldn't be the case in case of backpropagation. Yes.
Question. Thank you. In case of more than 2 or 3 layers, actually, how do you modify the weights? I mean, in backpropagation, we have the problem of gradient vanishing, for example, when we have multiple layers. Here again, if you want to go backward and compute the gradient and now come forward to modify the weights, do you still have the problem of gradient vanishing or not?
So we haven't really analyzed deep, very deep networks, but I think that many of the properties would be inherited from artificial neural networks. So I think that if you inappropriately initialize the weights, then indeed you would have problems of vanishing gradients. But if you initialize weights appropriately, then this problem can be ameliorated. So you can imagine that there's this machine with which more layers, and if there's an extension of the spring and the output, all the hidden neurons will kind of change their activity, and the errors will propagate through this. And of course, for this to happen, the weights need to be initialized to a certain way. They cannot be initialized to 0, because then the activity will not propagate.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you. Okay. So on the basis of this kind of cartoon examples, we thought that, well, this networks should be faster in learning than backpropagation networks. But of course, backpropagation is just such a workhorse of machine learning. It has been optimized so much that we were wondering whether we could see the difference. And in our original work with James Whittington 5 years ago, when we simulated this predictive coding networks in the standard way it is done in machine learning, we didn't see any difference. But then we realized that actually machine learning does a lot of kind of tricks which are biologically unrealistic. And if you now look at the learning problems and try to bring them more to the kind of conditions in which they would have to be learned by humans and animals, then you can see some advantages. So the first thing which we notice is the issue of batch averaging. So when people use artificial neural networks in kind of machine learning, what they will do, they would basically calculate weight changes on, let's say, 50 different examples, and then calculate the average of these 50 weight changes and only then update the weights. And they have to do this because these individual weight changes are just so noisy that they are not reliable. So predictive coding reduces this noise in these weight changes. So if we want to use if we don't use the batch averaging, actually the predictive coding learns faster than backpropagation. So here you can see, for example, mean test error. So mean test error is a kind of like a quantification of the speed of learning for the two algorithms, and for each as a function of the batch size. So one is there is no batch averaging. So this is basically you update the weights after each presentation of the stimulus. And for each batch size, the learning rate was chosen optimally for each algorithm. And you can see that indeed there is a small but significant advantage of this predictive coding network over backpropagation if you do not do this batch averaging. And also the minimum of the test error is also improved. Another thing we notice is the amount of data. So for example, if you have smaller number of training points, then indeed predictive coding, which is shown here in blue, gets better performance than backprop. So these two differences were quite small, but you can actually get quite big differences in performance if you have tasks in which the mapping between input and output is changing. And in machine learning, people often talk about this concept drifting tasks. So let me just illustrate. So here we used some standard machine learning data set called a fashion MNest, which involves classifying photographs of different pieces of clothing into 10 classes. And the network has been trained to do this. And then from time to time, the mapping between the output and the classes has been reversed for some of the classes, but not for others. So for example, here you can see that for these 3 classes, we switch the meaning of the outputs, but we don't do this for the other classes. So basically in this graph, we have a network which is trained, and then 0 is the first reversal. And you can see that after such reversal, predictive coding can relearn this new relationship quickly, while backprop has big problems with this. And there's a big performance gap here. And maybe this is not so surprising because this task is very similar to the salmon problem, right? So in the salmon problem, you also modify part of the information, but but you have to keep the other part. So these predictive coding networks are really good in the situations where you kind of have to modify part of information, but retain the other information. Yes, another closely related problem is a continual learning. So we are training the network on 2 different tasks in alternation. And again, you have an advantage. And we also tried deep reinforcement learning tasks where there were also advantages. And I think it's connected with the fact that in deep reinforcement learning, the training signal, the prediction error, is driven partially by the network itself. If you are kind of familiar with how these networks work. So basically, any kind of noise in the output of the network is being accumulated. So predictive coding networks which reduce this noise kind of work better. Okay, so this is all kind of nice. This is kind of classical machine learning benchmark, but we wanted to see if we can explain some behavioral data or some neural data with this model. And we noticed that in the literature, there are several studies which proposed that during learning, brain infers latent state from feedback. And we noticed that this, I'll probably describe a few of the studies. And all this, to model the studies, the authors developed very complex, abstract Bayesian models to describe them. But we thought that we can probably explain all these studies with these super simple mechanistic predictive coding networks by just noticing that this inference of the latent state corresponds to basically changes in activity of these hidden layers to this prospective configuration, because these hidden layers really encode the latent state. So we tried to kind of explain the existing data with this kind of simple mechanistic model. So the first task which I would like to present is from the motor learning domain. So this is a paper by Hild et al. So in this experiment, people had to move a stick on a particular apparatus in a particular direction to reach some particular target direction. However, the stick was also controlled by a little robot, which was providing perturbation. So in this example, the participant had to move the stick to the right, but there was a perturbation upward. So the participants in this task have to kind of learn to compensate this perturbation, and they have to learn how much to compensate. And in this example, there were actually 2 types of trials. So there were trials with blue background where the perturbation was positive, and trials with red background where the perturbation was negative. So the participants had to learn to apply to the different perturbations in different conditions. So how you can kind of conceptualize this task? So if you did some kind of like a standard reinforcement learning, some simple reinforcement learning, you would think that they have to associate some perturbation with the color of the background. However, if you now think that the networks in the brain are deeper, you can imagine that the networks in the brain between the perception and the prediction of the perturbation will have some kind of intermediate layer. And this intermediate layer could be conceptualized as, for example, belief of being in a state connected with this type of trial. So for example, if we have this blue trials where we have blue background and positive perturbation, we have a belief state of being in this trial, which I would denote by B with brackets. So the authors of the study by Hill et al. Ask if consider that participants can infer being in this belief state B in two ways, either by seeing blue background or by seeing the positive perturbation, because both of this stimuli or feedbacks are associated with this belief state. So they ask the following question: so can this belief state be also activated by the perturbation, not only by the stimulus? And to answer this question, they had like two more conditions in this experiment. So after this training, there was some kind of washout session during which no perturbation was provided for the stimuli. And then they had this kind of testing session where they investigated how much people learned from a single trial. So in this testing session, they were presenting different trials with different perturbations, with different combinations of the color and the perturbation. And before this critical trial and after, there were trials with blue background where they measured the adaptation. So basically, they wanted to ask if this belief state can be activated by positive perturbation alone. So the critical trial is the trial where there was a positive perturbation with red background. So if they activated this belief state and performed some kind of learning about this belief state, then when they now test this adaptation in the blue background, they should see a difference. And indeed, this is the change in adaptations in this for these 4 different trial types. And indeed, they saw quite a big change in the adaptation for this stimulus, which was in fact even bigger than for this trial, which is very surprising because they were testing how much people learned about blue background. And there was the learning here was smaller than here. So this is quite complicated experiment. I actually never presented this before. Does this experiment make sense? Is this clear, what they did here? And any questions? Yes?
Sorry, quick, I'm just not quite clear on it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're tested on the blue.
Mm-hmm.
So they're tested on the blue, but the effect is seen on the red.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
It's just
Okay. So that's why it's a very paradoxical effect. That's a kind of interesting effect. Yes. And they explain it. So their explanation was that what happens is that by showing this test trial with a red background, somehow participants activated this belief state of being in the blue state, and they learned about the perturbation in the blue state. And that's why there's a change in adaptation. Yeah, so this is a strange effect. Yeah, so it should be strange, right? And it doesn't make, I mean, it doesn't make sense at the moment, but at least is it clear what the data are showing? Okay. Yeah, and then they had some kind of like a Bayesian model explaining this in some kind of normative way. So now what we try to do, oh, yes, please. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. That's just observation, or that's also training?
So basically, all this, are you asking about these 4 graphs?
No, so the testing session, so you have 3 different subplots. So the middle one that you're showing the color and the perturbation combination with conflict to the training one. So that one is observation or active training?
Both, right? So this is some kind of, because what they were interested in, looking at the effects of learning on a single trial. Yes. So they basically performed a single trial of learning, and then they measure adaptation on these 2 trials. So basically, you can measure how much people learned by looking at the difference in the adaptation between these two trials. Yeah, so if the adaptation is different on this trial than on this trial, it means that people have learned something during this training trial, how much they need to adapt. Yes, does this answer the question? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so to explain where these strange effects come from, we considered a very simple predictive coding network, which again, we try to kind of come up with a minimum architecture. So we have two input nodes describing the color of the background, two output nodes describing how much they predict the compensation is needed for the two directions, and two hidden states. So you can imagine, how the weights in this network would evolve during training. So during training, you would basically build strong weights here because the blue background is associated with positive perturbation and analogously here, and there's like no weights here. And then during washout session, this weights would just get smaller because people kind of unlearn, but there is some kind of trace of these connections. So now what happens in this red trial in the predictive coding network is shown here. So yes, by the way, predictive coding networks can replicate qualitatively this pattern of result. And they do this because when you see so this is the kind of the pattern which you provide. So you see the red background, but you experience positive perturbation. So what happens in these predictive coding networks is that because you have a positive perturbation and this blue hidden node is connected with positive perturbation, you can imagine now the machine that this spring here would be extended and would essentially bring this node up. So this node would get activated. And then, because now you have error on this node, because you still have an error on this node, that this spring wouldn't be reduced completely, and activated presynaptic neuron, during learning, you would increase this weight. And since you increase this weight, on the next trial, when you see the blue background, you change your perturbation. Of course, the backpropagation would not do this, because in backpropagation, you do not change the activity of hidden neurons during training. So basically, the backpropagation only would predict that you are learning about the blue background. So as you can see that this is an example that these predictive coding networks can replicate some kind of simple counterintuitive examples. Any questions to this experiment? Okay, how much time do I still have? 10 minutes. Okay. So maybe quite briefly wanted to kind of describe two other studies. So similar effects have been seen in other domains. So I will not describe the model, but it's kind of like analogous effect seen in a different domain. So this is a like very old animal studies of field conditioning, which shows that you can have a situation that learning about one stimulus can alter your association about another stimulus, which is another very strange effect. So basically, let me describe the paradigm. So in this experiment, an animal was associating a fear. So basically, it was receiving electric shock after presentation of both light and sound. And there were two groups of animals. And in one of the groups, there was an extension session during which the light was presented with no shock. And then both groups were tested in kind of fear response to sound. So how much the rat is freezing in response to sound. And if you look at these experiments, you think that there should be no difference because this extension is basically telling the animal what's the probability of shock connected with light. So it doesn't tell it anything about the probability of shock connected with sound. However, what has been observed that in fact the fear for sound is higher in this group than in this group. So by presenting somehow light with no shock, the animal inferred that there would be higher probability of getting a shock connected with sound. So you can see the data here in red. And this is again kind of like a strange effect which you cannot explain with like standard reinforcement learning models like the Scholar-Wagner model. But again, you can, if you simulate now predictive coding and backpropagation cannot explain it. So it produces exactly the same field conditioning for both conditions, because it's based on feed-forward information propagation, while predictive coding is able to reproduce the results. And essentially, predictive coding does it in an analogous way as I described before. So what happens is that when you have the activation of light, there is an error here, and this error not only activates this unit, but also activates this unit and leads to the changes in the weight in this pathway. So it's kind of analogous mechanism in different domain. Okay. So the last experiment I wanted to describe is in the domain of reinforcement learning. So this is an interesting experiment in which the authors showed that humans are able to learn kind of interesting properties of task structure in a structured reinforcement learning experiment. So in this experiment, people had to make choices between two options and received rewards, so you could either win $1 or lose $1. And each option had certain probability of being rewarded. For one option, it was 40%, for the other option was 70%. So it's kind of easy task to learn. But the trick was that from time to time, the probabilities were swapped. But critically, they were swapped such that if one probability went up, the other went down. So they were always swapped symmetrically. So they were not changing randomly, they were always swapping between 40 and 70. And these authors now then argued on the basis of the activity of reward regions that people have learned the structure of the task. Yes. So this graph shows the activity of medial prefrontal cortex. So this is one of the area which is thought to reflect the expected reward in the task. And we have two trials. So we have a trial, we consider a trial when the participant loses $1 and the immediately following trial. And now there are two options. If the participant lost $1, the participant could either stay with the same option or switch to a different option. So when they stay with the same option, it's kind of not very surprising that they decreased the value. They decreased the expectation for the reward for this option because they just lost. So then on the next try, they expect to less probability of winning. But importantly, when they lost and switched to another option, they actually expect higher reward. So they have learned that if this option is bad, it means that the other option is probably better. So if the value of this option went down, probably the value of the other option is going up. So that's why you can see that this activity on the next trial is higher here. And again, we try to kind of model this with some kind of like minimal model. So we have a neuron, which is just equal always to 1, is describing just being in the task. And then two output neurons, which are predicting the value of the two options. And we have some kind of hidden neuron representing some kind of latent state, basically describing which of these options is being rewarded currently in the current fraction of the task. And if we basically simulate this kind of model and train it either with backpropagation or with predictive coding, we can see that backpropagation cannot reproduce this data, while predictive coding can. And I think that for the sake of time, I will skip the detailed explanation of this. But the general idea is that when you get negative feedback, the predictive coding network is able to swap the activity of this hidden neuron to a different state, basically inferring that probably the rewarded option has been changed, and then update the weights after such inference, while the backpropagation doesn't do it. And I have some kind of detailed explanation of this, but maybe I will skip it for the purpose of time. Okay. Okay, so now just maybe like a few discussion point on the general feature of this predictive coding network. So as I mentioned before, us and also others were interested how you get exact backpropagation in this kind of family of models like predictive coding networks, but also other authors look at different models which are based around Hopfield networks, and they all end up with a similar conclusion that all these models will approach backpropagation if you prevent the changes of neural activity during this kind of relaxation. So you don't want to change the neural activity when you provide the target. And many people, including us, came up with various mechanisms how to avoid these changes of the hidden neural activity to get backpropagation. But now we realize that these changes in this neural activity is not a bug, it's a feature, it's a critical element of this model, which actually reduces interference. So it shouldn't be avoided in the real systems. And this reconfiguration of the hidden activity during learning is in fact the key element which allows this network to achieve better learning performance in various tasks, learning contexts faced by animals and humans, and also is able to explain this experimental data from this diverse complex learning tasks. And also this prospective configuration offers one of the answers how the brain solves this plasticity-stability dilemma. So experimental data suggests that even in our adult life, we still update our representation in V1. So if we update our representation in V1, how is it possible that we see anything, right? So this prospective configuration offers one of possible answers. Well, you have the mechanism that when some weights are modified, you immediately do compensatory changes in other weights to kind of maintain other associations which have been learned. And of course, I'm not claiming that this is the only mechanism proposed to reduce interference. There's many other mechanisms which have been proposed to reduce interference in the literature, which are also kind of biologically grounded. And it's highly likely that all these mechanisms operate in parallel to reduce the interference most effectively. Another really nice feature of this predictive coding networks, which I really like, is that these networks are fully autonomous. That there is no any external homunculus. We need to route the information to these networks, change the weights. You can only control these networks by providing the inputs. And you either fix some nodes and the network then learns, or you don't fix the nodes. For example, in the prediction, when you just provide the inputs on one side of this network, you use exactly the same rules for dynamics and the plasticity. And in the prediction, there is simply no learning because all the errors converge to zero. So the learning, which is proportional to error, is equal to zero. So the kind of Hebbian plasticity doesn't give you any weight modification. Okay. So in summary, I presented the predictive coding networks, which infer neural activity before plasticity. And this inference of this kind of prospective configuration enables more effective learning in many contexts faced biological animals, and also can explain neural activity and behavior in a diverse task. And just wanted to acknowledge that this work was really driven by Yuhang Song and also Beren Milic. And if you want to find more information, we have a preprint available on this. Thank you very much.
We do have one question from Dan. It is a bit long though, so Dan, you're more than welcome to chime in. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it out for you.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the main differences that I can see between predictive coding and backprop is that backprop doesn't really learn if you don't have any errors, whereas predictive coding can learn from positive instances as well. And that was very clear in the bear and salmon example. The example you gave with fear conditioning reminded me of the types of selective attention explanations that are often used with back-propagation models to explain things like blocking and highlighting, which are very similar types of paradigms to the fear conditioning paradigm you described. And I was wondering how predictive coding and is related to those selective attention accounts, and whether it's an alternative to them, or whether it's a mechanism that operates, or whether selective attention is a mechanism that might operate alongside predictive coding.
Thank you. Could you explain, I heard this name, selective attention, but unfortunately I forgot what it is. Could you remind me what the selective attention is?
So it's usually instantiated as kind of a capacity limited selective weighting of the inputs. So if, for instance, in the fear conditioning example, whenever you get light and the sound paired with shock, whenever you get the light on its own paired with shock, you would provide additional weight to the light that takes away from the sound stimulus, for instance. So in things like highlighting paradigms where you see something similar, you learn a lot about the light in that instance, but you don't learn very much about the shock. So the kind of initial learning about or you don't learn very much about the sound. So the initial learning about the sound kind of carries through that second extinction phase. So you get higher prediction or higher instance of freezing during the test phase for the second case compared to the first case.
So, but why there is a difference between these two groups?
Because in the second case, you have a shift in attention to learning about the light, which preserves what you've learned about the sound in the second case, but not in the first case where you're not receiving any kind of stimulation. It's hard for me to kind of do this on the fly. Trying to duck around various other Zoom windows. Suffice it to say that the selective attention mechanism provides additional weights to the inputs that isn't kind of built into the network already. Mm-hmm. And that can allow things like back-propagation to predict differential effects that you don't see without it.
Okay, so maybe I will answer part of this question. So I definitely these predictive coding networks will inherit some other aspects from backpropagation. So they can explain some kind of blocking as well phenomena. So for example, in this experiment, in fact, there was also a third group. And a third group, I think that in the first condition was only getting the shock connected with sound without the light. And it had quite big response to shock in comparison to the group which was receiving shock with both light and sound, right? And essentially, both predictive coding, like standard Rescola-Wagner model would explain this by saying that, well, these two, you need smaller weights from light and sound to explain the shock, and then you need to have a strong weight from sound alone to explain the shock. So basically, you will have a reduced response in this condition, and predictive coding inherits this. So it's also an error-driven model. It's also trying to kind of minimize error, but it has this kind of additional twist. And how it relates to attentional mechanisms. So I would have to, yeah, I don't know, maybe we can have some kind of Zoom discussion later. I would have to kind of understand better how this attention mechanism actually works here.
No worries, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question related to this slide too. My understanding is that in the space of phenomena here, the one that's hardest for error-driven learning is backwards blocking. So can you say something about whether your approach gets that or not?
I have to admit that I'm not an expert in this. Could you explain what is backwards blocking?
So I think backwards blocking would be the same as this example in the middle row. Yeah, so it starts the same. Then in the middle panel, you show that the light still is paired with shock. And now the question is, does the rat figure out that probably the sound wasn't responsible for shock, because now there's an explanation for why there was a shock in the first panel, which is a light. And so the prediction would be that sound alone is thought to be less likely to produce shock than it was at the start.
That's great suggestion. Yes, I'm sure that predictive coding network would do, right? Because it would activate yes, okay. Yes, so what would happen in predictive coding network in the situation that, so you have light, you have shock, so these two nodes are equal to 1, but you have only weights of half here. So this neuron is activated, and to compensate for this, you would also need to activate this neuron. And so the predictive coding network would also activate this neuron. So it would modify the weights here. I should make a note. Thank you. So I haven't heard about this phenomenon, but I guess it's another phenomenon which could be explained.
Yeah, that would be cool if it can.
Thank you.
One more question in the chat, although maybe we might leave it there because we are a little bit ahead over time. It's from Hinza. Hinza, do you also want to chime in? Because it's a bit long. Otherwise, I'm happy to read out what you've written.
Sure thing. So thank you for an amazing talk. Really, really interesting work. My question is that you're talking about that there's sort of predictive mechanisms and then there's heavy learning mechanisms, and you sort of commented that they are operating on different timescales. But I was wondering if you could comment on in absolute terms what those timescales are. Are we talking about prediction happening in the order of milliseconds and the heavy learning on the order of seconds, or are they not so separated?
Okay, so this is a very good question. So the way you simulate these networks is that you, when you provide the training example, you first wait for the network to converge, and then only once the network converges, you modify the weights. And there's, the question to what timescales this would translate in the biology. Well, you can, of course, we haven't really done this, but you can kind of speculate that maybe the initial convergence is really very quick, within like couple 20 milliseconds, orders of 10 of milliseconds, the initial convergence, and then the learning takes place then. But yes, it's a very, very good question. We haven't really tried to map it on the biological timescales more precisely.
Cool, thank you very much.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. And yeah, thank you for presenting.
Yeah, thank you.